Good evening, everybody. Good evening. Good evening. We are so glad that you are joining us for our Black History Talk series, an enduring history. We've had an amazing few weeks. We're going to give a couple seconds for you guys to log on. And if you've been a part of this series before, definitely let us know in the comments. Let us know how it has been. For those of you that don't know, I'm Pastor Lauren. I serve as the online campus pastor here at the Life Church RVA, and we have been in an amazing series on different aspects of Black history and culture. We've got to talk with some amazing experts over the last few weeks. And if you've missed some of the last few weeks, you can watch the replay by visiting us on Facebook or YouTube. But we're so glad that you are here. Tonight's conversation is going to be absolutely incredible. We have an amazing guest. But before we get into that conversation, we just want you to do a couple of things. First, make sure that you share this conversation. Tonight, we're talking about Black faith and theology. I believe that you guys are going to be enriched by what is discussed on tonight. So make sure you share this conversation with someone that you know will just be really inspired, maybe with someone who's even had questions about Black faith and theology and its importance, not only in history, but even today. And then make sure that you're settled. Get a notebook, get your phone, get your notes app, and really dive in. Let's lean into this conversation and see what good things we can come out of it. So, none other than our very own Pastor Vernon Gordon, the senior pastor of the Life Church, is joining us tonight. Not only is he the pastor of the Life Church, but he holds a Master's of Divinity from the Samuel D. Wood Proctor School of Theology, an awesome theology program that's based in an HBCU. He also does really amazing work around social justice, bridging cultures. He is the founder of Mosaic, an organization built around educating around social justice issues and so many other things. So before I continue to introduce him, I would love for him to introduce himself. Please help us welcome Pastor Vernon Gordon.
Hey, everybody. So excited to be here. Pastor Lauren, excited about this conversation. Let's do it.
Absolutely. Well, I'm so excited. We're going to dig right in. I feel like you have so much to share about this topic. And so my first question for you, I want to know, how has the Black church shaped your faith as a believer? We know that you're a pastor, but you have some roots within the Black church. And when we look at where you are now and where you started, how has the Black church shaped your faith as a believer?
Absolutely. Well, first and foremost, I think the Black church plays a significant role in all of our history. When we see ourselves, we should, as African Americans, see the Black church in that history, from education all the way down through community development. We are all the byproduct of the sacrifice and the investment of the Black church. My story is no different. Much of my academic support and enrichment, as well as my community evolution, was the result of the Black church experience. My best friends were at the Black church. The places I had, recreated and had recreation were connected to the Black church in many weekends and throughout my life. And so that was critical. I also think we're all framed and formed by example. And so for me, my greatest examples of life and leadership were coming through in and through the Black church. My grandmother started the church I grew up in her garage, and growing up in that small family church, seeing the pioneering of a Black pastor, and then her nephew, my pastor, Dr. Legis E. McCoy, was my pastor, and so the Black church has played a critical role in my spiritual formation, both in my family experience as well as my communal experience, and so it's been a huge part of my journey, and I'm the better because of it. So.
That's really awesome. So you mentioned the sacrifice that
Yeah.
our culture and our history has played. I want to know, just from your perspective, what an impact do you feel like the gospel has had on the endurance of Black Americans as a people. And you've been in this series, the sermon series right now on endurance.
Yep.
What part do you feel like the gospel has played in the endurance of Black Americans?
A great question. I mean, I think it has been critical. I think without faith, many of our forefathers and foremothers would have given up hope. But there was a thread by which the gospel gave them hope. When I think about even the intersection between the gospel and how that empowered social justice and pioneers of change in society, you cannot see some of the pioneers of American culture and equity without seeing the gospel as the fuel. Representative John Lewis, right,
Mhm.
was a minister who went to seminary, right? His political ideology was framed through his gospel theology.
Mhm.
We know some of the common names like Martin Luther King Jr., but there's other advocates like Reverend C.T. Vivian, Al Sharpton, Reverend Jesse Jackson, modern leaders like Jamal Bryant and so many others. And so I think the gospel has been a resource and a source of not only framing our ideology about what our country and what our humanity should look like, but it also has then empowered some of our policy making
Mhm.
about what we feel like equity and equality should look like. And all of that is rooted in the message of the gospel, which is centered around here's the plain and straight of it, a Black and brown man who
Yes.
found himself in a culture where he was a part of an oppressed and marginalized population, and then literally said, I come so that the oppressed might find liberation,
Yeah.
to set the captive free, and to proclaim this gospel. So I think the gospel at its foundation has again formed our ideology as well as our policy making, and it's played a central role in all of our journey.
That's really awesome. So you listed a lot of really amazing civil rights activists who
Yep.
also found their roots in ministry, in divinity. I want to know, when looking at your own role, what responsibility have you felt to uphold the justice part of the gospel, especially as a clergyman?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a nuanced one, right? Because and some may know my background, but I come from a very diverse family, and yet I come from a family that is very much so been on the pioneer and front facing of equality endeavors. On one side of my family, I had my grandmother who was married to a white man from Bath Springs, Tennessee, and so
Mhm.
I embody the message of the gospel that is rooted in unity. And as Scripture tells us, we neither new nor Gentile, slave nor free, but one body. Okay, I get that, and I
Mhm.
affirm that. On the other side of that, I had the grandfather who was the first African American everything in the Chesapeake and Norfolk Police Department, sheriff and captain, and retired as colonel, and he made it abundantly clear to us the value of our faith existence. And so I think by and large, I think it has been important for me as a pastor to never lose sight of, it's not either or, but it's both and.
Yeah.
That God calls us to never quiet our voices, because the greatest form of violence is silence. And
Mhm.
so we have to consistently be advocates and active in the pursuit of honoring all humanity. And at the same time, I like to say it like this: we cannot become that which we hate in the
Mhm.
process.
That's really
Um, and so just encouraging all of us to make sure that we maintain the purity of our heart, which has to learn to love others, and yet not let us play the fool,
yeah.
and represent that we also have to continue to press forward towards the prize and the high calling of equality, equity, and a forward movement.
That's really good. That's really good. So, we've also just kind of experienced a lot of change over
Mhm,
generations, right?
mhm.
And we see that change not only in what we experience as a people, but even in the constructs of some of our society. So we look at the role that the church played during the civil rights movement and how strong it was. and some modern day preachers and activists that are on the forefront of today's issues, you being one of them. Do you still feel that the church plays a significant role in the advancement of Black people?
Oh my goodness. Okay, so I'm gonna get in trouble with this question, maybe slightly, but here's what I believe. I believe several things have evolved in our culture that do not diminish the responsibility of the church, but our role has changed.
Mhm.
In particular, I will say this. I think when I see where we are, and I think my good friend Pastor John Faison says this a little bit better than I. He says the challenge of the Black church is how do we now be a part of a movement that we are no longer the center of?
Mm, yeah,
Historically, the Black church was at the center of every movement. So people couldn't, they couldn't assemble without a meeting place, right? They could not mobilize without a central voice. And so people came to the Black church to be mobilized, to be informed about the position that they were taking as a community, and then to be mobilized. Here's where we're meeting, here's how we're marching, here's what we're advocating for. We're leaning all of our efforts and intentionality and energy here. When we think about the bus boycotts and all of those historical movements, they were rooted and grounded with the church at the center and the epicenter of them. But how do we be a part of movements that we're no longer the center of? When people don't need our churches to gather, when they don't
hmm,
need our voices to organize, when they no longer trust the Black church the same way, and any church for that matter, not just the Black church. Um, these realities require a different type of involvement. And so I still believe that we have the same ongoing responsibility, but we have to open ourselves to a reimagination for how we play a part in the movement. I also think the advent of technology creates this, where it used to be you needed access to platforms to
yeah,
be a part of being a voice. Now it is very possible that there are people in our congregations who have more influence who never step on our pulpits. And so I think we have to learn to honor the prophetic voices that are emerging beyond the pulpit and to partner with those voices to say we all still have one objective. And I think those are some of the ways we have to be thinking about our next steps.
That's really good. That's very insightful. And if you are listening to this and any part of this conversation has just sparked your interest, definitely let us know by leaving some likes and loves. But also make sure that you share this conversation by someone that you know would benefit from it as well. This has been really great so far. So we've got a couple more things that we want to ask you. We've talked about the Black church as it relates to a Black faith and theology as it relates to a societal construct. But even from a personal view, and this is a question I think that's for Black people as well as non-Black people. I want to know, just from your perspective, why is this concept, we've been using this term Black theology or Black faith, why is the Black perspective of theology or the way that we view God necessary, especially if we're all reading from the same Bible?
Well, I think that's a really good question. And I even frame it through a question I received recently from some people I would consider friends, but who are not African American. They said, "Hey, Vernon, why is it that it seems that the Black church still preaches so much from the Old Testament when we tend to lean into the New Testament?" And I told them, "Well, you can always lean into God's love when you're still not fighting for liberation."
Mm, mhm.
And I think that the Old Testament, historically and still to the present day, resonates with the Black community. It is a part of our hermeneutic because it is still a part of our reality.
Yeah,
I think that a Black theology, for lack of better words, is rooted in the Black experience, and so naturally we all look to see ourselves and to extract from Scripture, not to eisegete,
uh-huh.
but to extract from Scripture the encouragement that we need for our lives.
Yeah,
And so, as a result of that, I think African Americans tend to resonate deeply, not only with the love and the truth of the New Testament theology and gospel, but also with the ongoing struggle that is represented in Old Testament scripture and theology around oppression and overcoming and liberation and freedom from captivity and a journey through the wilderness to a promised land that many of us are still pursuing.
Yes. Yeah.
right?
Hmm.
And so I think it is important that we not lose that, because it is the fuel and it is the fire that keeps us going, reminding us that there is still a promised land to be pursued. That
Yeah.
just because some of us have made it, quote unquote, whatever that is, there are still absolutely injustices that we know have been put on full display in recent history. There are still absolutely policies and laws that still need reformation. There are still aspects of our society that require us to look back to the gospel and
Hmm.
to say, no, what does scripture say about this? Oh, scripture says that God is with us. Scripture tells us that God is for us. Scripture tells us that we should continue to set the oppressed free, and and liberate the prisoner. Scripture tells us. And when I read those things, I'm like, oh, this is absolutely where then initiatives like prison reform,
Yeah.
right, are influenced. This is absolutely where policy reformation is influenced. This is absolutely when we talk about police brutality is
Hmm.
influenced, right? Because we have to use scripture and use the gospel to not again be manipulated, but to purely see it as a support,
Hmm.
and as a source of how we strategize for the Black experience. So I think Black theology is about how we approach scripture and we see ourselves in the text.
Yeah.
And I don't think that discredits those who don't see themselves in those texts. I just think that it's important that we not lose seeing our reality as a Black and brown people in the biblical narrative. And so I think that's a huge part of the journey when we think about Black theology. I would say this lastly, too. I think there is something very um, um, important about not losing the multiple layers of which scripture allows us to pull ourselves out of it.
Mm.
Again, I'm not saying that to an extreme. I'm not saying that we should just be making up what we want in the scripture, but I think to minimize the Bible, to minimize the gospel to any one particular ethnic body, is to rob God of His fullness
Mm.
and
That's
how He is speaking to all of us differently. And so I think one of the dangers is to say you have to see it the way I see it, but that's the reason why hermeneutics exists, is so that we can say, hey, I appreciate your take on that, but here's what I hear and sense the Lord saying to me based on my experience, based on my history, past, present, and future.
yeah.
Um, and I think within reason, we have to never lose the ability to hear God through our various lenses for the sake of how His Spirit might empower all of us through the same text.
That's very good. That's super insightful. So, just a couple more questions for you. One, you kind of touched on this idea of the fact that there are a lot of things that we are still fighting for.
Yep.
There's a lot of, like, the reason why we see ourselves in the biblical narrative is because we come from the perspective of the oppressed fighting for
Yep.
freedom, right? So what do you say to those who say, we've endured a lot as a people,
Mhm.
lot has changed, but there's still so much that has stayed the same,
Yep.
or so much left to do. I don't know if the gospel matters to our struggle anymore. What do you
Mhm.
say to that person?
Mm. I think that part of our challenge has been the misrepresentation of the gospel.
Hmm.
So for somebody to say the gospel is not relevant to our present day endurance, I think is to to not see the gospel for the beauty that it is.
Mm,
It is the ongoing truth that God didn't just finish a work, but that He activated something in us
yeah.
to continue that work, right? To go and do likewise, to make disciples who also understand how to carry the gospel purely through their cultural experience, to to do even greater works, right?
Mhm.
I think that the gospel is not just a book with an end; it is a roadmap for a future.
That's good.
And so I believe that it still has very much so not only relevance but a powerful place in the life of every person who seeks to continue to see a more beautiful humanity in our culture and in our world. And I also would encourage people to never forget to bring the spirit, right, to the gospel. That when you bring it, when we bring only our eyes to the book, right, it becomes limited. When we bring our spirit man to the book, it awakens something in us to say, I've read that passage 15 times, and maybe it didn't do anything for me 2 years ago. But now, some God knew the appointed time for it to awaken something in me, to light a fire in me for the next chapter of my leadership, for the next chapter of my activism, for the next chapter of my parenting, for the
Yeah.
next chapter of my neighboring, for the next chapter. And so I think anytime I'm talking to somebody and they say, "Man, that was kind of good for a season," I say that sounds like you're bringing your eyes to the book, but not your spirit to the book.
That's good. That's good.
Um, and so I think we always have to let our spirit also discern and interact with the text, because I have never brought my spirit to the text and something new not been awakened.
Mhm.
Right. And so I think that's an important piece of the journey as well.
That's really good. I feel like you have helped us really just kind of illuminate the fact that the gospel has been something that has carried us really from beginning to where we are now. And it's what will carry us well into the future. One last question, and this was something that you touched on a little bit earlier, but I believe it's something that will hopefully inspire hearts.
Mhm.
Maybe it's something that they can even take in their personal walk with Christ as they learn how, as we collectively learn how to navigate this world as Black Americans, but also as believers.
Mhm.
So the last question I have for you is, how can we as believers still fight for our rights to justice and lead our lives with love?
Woo. Um, well, there's a hard answer to that, and there's a true answer to that. The first is we have to look to Jesus,
Mhm.
who's the author and finisher of our faith. I think I love to say it like this. I think a lot of us love what Jesus did for us, but we don't want to live like Jesus. And so we're like, yeah, yeah, I'm cool with what he did for me, but I'm not gonna be
Doing all that.
yeah, I'm not gonna be doing all of that, right? Like loving people, forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do. No, 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 no. I don't got time for that. I think looking to Jesus, who's the author and finisher of our faith, I think he shows us the example of how to continue to fight and yet also walk in love.
Yeah.
Um, and I think as we look to Jesus, I think spiritual formation at its core is about asking ourselves each day, how do I form myself more into the image of Jesus, the
Mhm.
behavior of Jesus, the words of Jesus, the ways of Jesus? I think that is the starting point. I think in addition to that, I think the other thing we have to do is we have to give ourselves permission to have reservoirs of joy and refuge.
Mhm.
Um, it is hard to be fighting all the time and yet to maintain a heart of love at the same time. We get tired and our emotions run dry, our patience runs thin. And so, what is required of us is the ability to say, okay, where do I need refuge? What seasons do I need to escape to reservoirs of joy, to places where I can be restored and revived, so that my love doesn't get depleted in the process of fighting for equality, equity, and justice. And
Yeah.
so I think that it takes awareness, self-awareness to know I need to pull back a little bit. I think all people marching feet get tired at some point,
Mhm.
and it's okay to rest your feet for a season and then jump back into the race and see what the end's going to be. So I think those two things: look to Jesus, study Jesus's life, and I think we see a roadmap and a model for what it means to love and fight, but then also be self-aware enough to not only know when your fight is starting to fatigue you, but
Yes.
then where do I run to? Because if you haven't identified the refuge, the reservoirs of joy, you'll find yourself ultimately always pushing and never, restoring. And so I think you got to do all three of those things.
That's really, really good. Thank you so much. This conversation has been so enriching. I believe it'll be uplifting for some. I believe it'll be insightful for others. And I really pray, and I think just the goal of these conversations is no matter whether we're talking about mental health and wellness, or we're talking about the impact of Black culture, or we're talking about Black stories, or we're talking about Black faith, Jesus is really at the center of everything it is that we do. And as we continue to build our history and grow for generations, I think having that strong foundation is what will ensure that strength and endurance continues to last. So thank you so much for what you brought to this conversation. We hope that you all enjoyed this conversation, and don't forget to join us next Thursday at 7 p.m. on Facebook and YouTube. It is Ladies Night. We are talking to women and looking at their impact on Black history and Black culture. Thank you so much again, Pastor Vernon, for joining us, and we will see you guys later.